So this is what I got from my teacher. What am I supposed to do? Talk to the teacher, hope for the best the next time, or maybe I should be thinking about a tutor? I don't really know. Hi, welcome to Living and Learning. I'm Karen Kugel, your host, and today we're going to talk about tutoring and whether you need one, when you need one, and what you could actually get in the way of benefits from seeing a tutor. I have with me today, I'm very pleased to say, I have with me Travis Miner, who actually is the president and founder of Open Door. Open Door is a tutoring agency in Concord and actually in Acton, Massachusetts as well. So he's got two cities. So I'm really pleased to have you here, Travis, as my expert guest to talk about tutoring and basically increasing your learning skills and anything that you might have as an academic goal and what tutoring can do for you. So thanks a lot for coming today.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, great. So, you know, in terms of this grade that I just showed you, let's just play off of this and say that I'm a middle schooler and this is my history paper and I just failed this test. And it's the first time. What should I be thinking of as a student, or if I'm a parent concerned about my kids' grades, what should I be thinking about this? Do I need a tutor or what?
I think the first really important step is to not catastrophize. That for a student to have that first experience of getting a disappointing or frustrating grade is, in many cases, a really wonderful learning opportunity. And especially when it's happening in middle school, those are grades that are never going to come back later to bite the student in most cases. And so I think the really important things to consider are, first and foremost, what happened? Why did I get this grade? What was missing? What did I do leading up to submitting this project or taking this test? Is this a reflection of the effort that I put into this? Or is this a reflection of something I don't understand or I don't know how to do? And it's not always the case that the student feels comfortable going to the teacher with those questions, but if the student is willing to have that conversation, I think that's a really, really important first step for the student to advocate for themselves, to say, I'm trying to understand how I got this grade so that I can learn from it and hopefully not get this grade again in the future. I think that's a really important first step for students to take when they're comfortable doing so. I think it's worth having a conversation with parents about it. I know from my own experience of getting a bad grade and not wanting to share that with my parents, and it is always better to be candid about it. And it's really important that in having these conversations when a student does have a frustrating grade, that parents listen without judgment to try to better understand what happened. And if we can understand what happened and how the student earned this grade, then we can figure out where do we go from here. If the student indicates that they didn't have adequate time to prepare, or maybe they had the time and they didn't use the time effectively, that suggests one sort of approach to future tests and future papers. Maybe it's planning a little bit further in advance. Maybe it's being mindful about what does this next week look like? When am I actually going to be able to get this work done? And identifying and scheduling that time in advance. Maybe it has to do with where and how the student's working. Are there a ton of distractions around them? Is the student constantly task switching? Do they have difficulty identifying, yes, I have these things I need to do, but what order should I actually do them in? And it's not uncommon for students to save the thing they want to do least for the very end of their work time. And so something that may have already been hard then is compounded by the fact that it's hard and the student's doing it when they're already fatigued. So thinking about how the student is doing the work. And then the other really important piece is, does the student know how to do what they need to be able to do in order to do well on this assignment? And that's where extra help can come in, that if a student doesn't have that skill and doesn't feel that the resources that are available at the school are doing the trick to get them there, that's when seeking outside help can be really beneficial, or if you identify that the student is really struggling to use their time effectively, to plan effectively. And ideally, those are situations where a tutor would provide a student with the tools, sort of being able to model the thought process for how do I use my time effectively, or how do I effectively proofread something that I've written. And over time, the student develops those skills and ultimately is again able to work independently, that when they're hiring a tutor, ideally they're hiring a tutor for a little while to get them through a tough stretch that helps them to again be independent in the future.
I see, okay. So if I can summarize what you just said, it's important to know what was the predecessor, the initiating event, how did this actually happen that they got the grade, and then the student should ask themselves, was I really adequately prepared? Was I studying or preparing in the right place? Did I give myself enough time to adequately, pace out what the assignment was? Was I clear on the assignment? And I like the fact that you said that the student should advocate for themselves, that they should actually be thinking, well, let me check in with the teacher. They're the ones that gave me the grade. Let me get the feedback from that person first and see what I need. And then for the parents to kind of encourage the student or their child without judgment on what they need to do to improve their grades the next time around, right? So I'm interested in talking about what I see in working with some students is that there's so many distractions nowadays. Either their programs are so planned with activities and things. It could be great activities, but sometimes they don't allot enough time for studying, or there's so many distractions. I don't know if you're seeing this, but I was wondering if you could talk about that, just working on the computer and how that plays a role in the students who could be absolutely brilliant, but still not maybe getting the grades that they would really like to get. Talk about that?
Absolutely. And I think many parents can probably relate to this experience with the sort of constant, never-ending barrage of emails, and there is always something to do as a distraction to take you away from the bigger or more important project that you really need to get done. And students experience the same thing in terms of text, distractions that come from social media, and also just that moment of you're working on the computer doing research and you open another tab to check a score, read a blog, whatever the case may be, and all of a sudden you've wandered elsewhere, and not only is that time lost, but also it takes time to get back to and into the task that you were originally working on. So there's a couple of things that students can do to try to make sure that they stay on task and focused when they're completing a project or working on homework. I think one of the really important things is to plan their time, that we don't just sit down and dive into the first thing in front of us, that if we know we have an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours during which we can work, before we actually start working, let's think about what we're going to do and the order in which we're going to do it. And also think about how will you break up that time, because at a certain point we become prone to distractions because we're fatigued, and it's okay to take breaks. We also want to be kind to ourselves in terms of thinking about how do I sustain myself for 3 hours? It's not going nonstop, it's making sure that I have a specific time when I'm going to get a snack or check a score, whatever that little thing is that's going to take us away for a little while. Two techniques that I've seen students find really helpful. One is a 2-2-2 method, and what this is, it takes 6 minutes and ideally makes for a really productive work time to follow, is on their phone, set a timer for 2 minutes, and that 2 minutes is a time to sit, breathe, do a short mindfulness exercise to basically be present in the moment, to try to move past or through the distractions that might come up or the other places your mind is wandering, to sort of ground yourself. This is where I am, and the next thing I'm going to do is complete these projects. The next 2 minutes is writing down what are the specific things that I intend to get done during this work session. And you want to be both specific and reasonable. It's not writing down complete history paper. It's writing down, find 5 resources, draft the outline, something like that that feels manageable. It's biting off something you can actually chew on. And then the last 2 minutes, and this is one of the really crucial parts, is put those in the order that you're going to do them so that you have a clear work plan. These are the things that I'm going to complete. This is the order in which I'm going to complete them. And the first thing we did was get ourselves in a good headspace to get that work done. So 2 minutes of mindfulness, 2 minutes of writing down what you need to do, and then 2 minutes of prioritizing, and then get to work. The other thing that can often work well for students is the Pomodoro method, where you have a specifically designated work time. Maybe it's 15 or 20 minutes. Then you take a 5-minute break, then another 15 or 20 minutes, then another 5-minute break. And it allows us to really fully commit to the work that we're doing during those 15 or 20 minutes, knowing that a break is coming. During that break, we have 5 minutes to sort of wander a little bit and to let those distractions happen. And then we know when that 5 minutes is up, it's another 15 to 20 minutes, which feels a lot more manageable than saying, I'm going to sit down and work for 2 hours nonstop. And it also means that when we get distracted, we know at the end of the 5 minutes, that's the time to come back to the project that we're working on. So those are 2 starting places. I think it's also important that students think about what are the things that are actually distracting me, and are those context dependent? Is it that I'm distracted by other things on the internet when I'm in my room because that's a place where I often surf the internet and watch videos on YouTube and stuff? Or is it that when I'm doing work on my computer, no matter where I am, I open another tab or start going down the rabbit hole on Wikipedia or whatever it may be, and then trying to find some tools that help us adapt to that. You can set up your computer to block certain sites during certain windows, things like that, that if it's really hard to resist the temptation, then we can use tools to sort of regulate ourselves a little bit. I think whenever possible, it's a really good idea to leave your phone in a different room than the room where you're actually going to be getting work done.
Wow, that's brilliant. I love that 2-2-2 approach. I think that's terrific. So I hope that students will and parents will be listening to it. I think we could all benefit from that, as you were saying, with the distractions. And I'm somewhat familiar with the Pomodoro approach as well. So some of the things that you're suggesting actually are aspects of maybe metacognition in terms of how someone learns. Could you talk a little bit about that? And then we'll go into talking about GPAs, grades, and studying for SATs and standardized tests, okay?
Absolutely. Metacognition and developing metacognition is a lifelong skill, reflecting on what habits and patterns we fall into time and again. That's a really important skill to develop, and I think middle school and high school present a really unique opportunity to start to develop that skill, because there is that moment when you receive feedback on a project or on a paper, on a test, and it's an opportunity to say, what happened? What were the habits or patterns that led to this grade? And thinking about what kind of headspace was I in when I was doing this work? What types of mistakes do I seem to make time and again? We see this especially in math classes, especially in standardized tests, that there are certain shortcuts that many students are inclined to take. And when we take those shortcuts, it's usually an indication that we're not being mindful about our work. We're so caught in the task at hand, and we're so focused on getting to the answer that we're not thinking about what are the challenges of this task, what are the types of mistakes I've made in the past, and what do I need to be thinking about in order to avoid them. And if a student can start to develop those skills in a middle school or high school math class, they will be so much better equipped for times later in life where we need to say, I made a mistake. What happened? How did it happen? And how do I stay mindful so I avoid making the same mistake in the future?
Yeah, I really like the way you're bringing in the point of mindfulness, and a little earlier in that 2-2-2 approach, the idea of giving yourself some time and some space, some breather room to relax, because we all know what stress can do to good studying approaches, right, and success. So let's say we go from middle school to high school students, and the importance of, and a lot of emphasis put on, not only GPAs for colleges, but also standardized testing. So what can you tell us about preparing for the SATs, ACT, and maybe tell us a little bit about, from your experience, the differences between those tests, and should you take both of them, those kinds of things?
Sure, absolutely. So I think one thing that comes up initially is, what's the importance of grades as opposed to standardized tests, as opposed to the difficulty of the student's curriculum when it comes to college admissions? And there was a NACAC survey, I think this was last year. 83% of schools said that SAT, ACT scores were of moderate or greater importance. They said 91% of schools said that about grades, and 80% of schools said that about the difficulty or the rigor of a student's curriculum. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when a student is taking a difficult class, that there are situations where a student says, this class is hard. I'm working hard for a B+ in this class. Should I stick it out? And in many cases, the answer is yes. Colleges would rather see you work to rise to a challenge than to simply fold your hand and move to a class where you can cruise. So I think that's important for families to be aware of when they're thinking about what choices do we make based on grades, based on GPA. Seeing an upward trajectory over the course of high school is also really important to colleges. When it comes to the SAT and the ACT, right now we are working with a really messy and constantly shifting landscape. There are a lot of things that have changed in the past couple of years, and a lot of changes that we will likely see in the next couple of years, but it's not yet clear how it will play out, which makes it really difficult for families and students to plan well in advance. So the first thing that families should know about the two tests is that every school that requires standardized testing will accept either the SAT or the ACT. What that means for students is that it's really about figuring out which test is the right fit for you and focusing solely on that test. There are students who end up taking both tests, and if that's going to help them sleep better at night, that they know, I've tried both tests, I did my best on both, and I feel good about that, okay, that's not a bad reason to take both tests. However, at the end of the day, a student really only needs to take one test or the other. Now, this means that choosing between the two tests becomes really important. It's worth putting in a little bit more time up front in order to make a wise decision that ideally saves a family a whole lot of time and money down the line. Now, what that actually looks like is that for most students, this means during junior year, I'd say probably during the fall or winter of junior year, a student should try a diagnostic SAT and a diagnostic ACT. That doesn't mean go and sign up for the official ACT and go take it at an official testing center. That means take a test either at home or at the library, check your scores, and do that for both tests so that you can compare the results, and you can also compare the experience of taking both of the tests. Then you can make an informed decision based on the scores, based on your experience, which one feels like the right fit for you, and go with that test. So that means that a student, there is the drag of the student's going to have to take 2 full-length tests, and that is a little bit more time up front. But if the student's making an informed, data-driven decision about which test to take, then they're saving themselves a lot of time down the line. It also means that in terms of their process of getting ready for one test or the other, if they're making the right choice in terms of which test to take, that means they're probably going to have to spend less time, money, and energy getting ready for the test so that they can get the scores they need and move on to the many other things that are far more important. one of the big questions that families have is, well, what even is the difference between these two tests? And in many ways, they're similar in the sense that a student's going to go to a testing center, they're going to fill out bubbles, answering multiple choice questions for about 3.5 hours, and then they're going to anxiously wait for 2 weeks to get their scores. So there's a lot in common in terms of the experience, but there's some pretty significant differences in terms of the nuances of the tests. The SAT's personality tends to be that it's a little bit more subtle and sophisticated, but it covers a smaller range of content. So what that actually looks like is, for example, in the reading section, on the SAT, in my experience, the wrong answers are wrong for really subtle reasons. It requires students to be really attuned to the precision of language. Is it too extreme to use the word most and instead we should have used the word many? That might be a deal breaker for an answer choice. So a student who's not reading carefully, not really paying attention to each and every word, is likely to make mistakes, not because they can't answer that question, but because they're maybe using a different skill than the SAT is actually looking for them to use, which is really that care, precision, and attention to detail. In the math section, the SAT is largely algebra and algebra 2, which for some students, especially students who had a really tough time in geometry, that can be a great fit. It also means that students will need to be pretty comfortable solving word problems, and oftentimes tricky word problems that require us to sort of build an equation and then test it out to say, did I set this up correctly? Because if you set it up correctly, it's an easy problem. And if you didn't set the equation up correctly the first time, there's really no way they're going to end up getting the right answer. So the SAT, a little bit more subtle, nuanced with an emphasis on the precision of language. The ACT is a test that tends to be more direct and straightforward. In many ways, it's sort of two separate tests. The English and math section is content driven. Does the student know the necessary grammar rules? Does the student know the formulas, the rules, the equations that they need to in the math section? The math on the ACT covers a slightly broader range of material with a little bit more geometry, a little bit more pre-calc and trig. So for students who feel comfortable with a broader range of math, and maybe students who find the word problems on the SAT really difficult, the math section on the ACT can be a good fit for those reasons. Also, the second half of the ACT is about finding information and finding it quickly. So there's a reading section and a science section. The reading section is sort of what you'd expect, a number of passages with 10 questions each about them. The science section is deceptively similar. It's several passages, but this time they include charts and graphs and tables, and then a bunch of questions about them. And for both the reading and the science section, the student's job is to review this new piece of information they've been given, whether it's a text or a chart or a graph, and then answer questions by finding information in that text or graph, which is, in many ways, it's a more straightforward task than what the SAT asks students to do. The catch is that the timing on the ACT reading and science section can be really difficult for students. They're sections that move very quickly. They don't give people as much time as it would really be nice to have in order to answer that many questions and read that much text. So it's often the case that if students are comfortable with the pacing of the ACT, it's a good fit for them. And if that's a really difficult hurdle for them, the SAT might be a much better fit because it does allow students more time to be thoughtful about their answers, to go back to the text. It's just not quite as frantic a pace on the SAT.
I see. So, excuse me, when someone is preparing for, do I want SAT, ACT, maybe take both, do you offer at Open Door a kind of diagnostic test? So that's one question. And then the other question I know people ask me all the time too is how soon do I have to start preparing for the test? So can you address that for me?
Absolutely. So we offer free full-length diagnostic tests.
Oh, you do?
Pretty much every weekend. We'll also offer some at local schools, occasionally here at CC and at Acton Boxborough. So students, whether they're seeking to work with a tutor or they just want to try both tests, that's something that they can do for free most any weekend. Now, once they've taken those diagnostic, and it's important to note that it's usually a matter of doing two separate diagnostics, one for the SAT and one for the ACT. There are some blended tests out there that organizations that say, if you take this one test, we can tell whether it's the SAT or the ACT. In my experience, that's often too small of a sample size, and there's really no good substitute or shortcut to try the full test, see how it goes, and compare those experience and scores, because ultimately that's what students are going to have to do. They'll have to take the full test. So it really means taking two, whether it's a Saturday morning or a Sunday afternoon, take a full diagnostic test of each. Probably do those on back-to-back weekends if possible. One diagnostic one weekend, the other the next. It's worth noting that some students use their PSAT scores as a proxy for an SAT. They say, well, I took the PSAT, I got these results, and that seems like a sort of good enough comparison point instead of taking an SAT diagnostic. And oftentimes that is an okay comparison to make. It's never quite as good as tests that are taken on back-to-back weekends or a full-length SAT. But PSAT scores are a good proxy for SAT scores. So once the students take those diagnostics and decide which test to take, preparing is really going to depend on where the student is starting score-wise, where the student hopes to be, but also what does that student's year and school calendar and extracurricular calendar look like? And this is where if a student does these diagnostics in the first half or middle third of their junior year, they're giving themselves enough time to be thoughtful about when will they actually take the test so that they can plan around extracurriculars. If a student plays a spring sport, then the May SAT may not be the best bet for them. Maybe they prepare, take a March test, take a break, and then if and when they retest, they would do that in the summer or fall of junior year. And we typically see that students will generally take the test 2, maybe 3 times, usually once, maybe twice during their junior year, and then once, maybe twice during the summer or fall leading into senior year. And in many cases, we see that families want to test early. They want to get this done as early as possible, which makes sense, and that is a good reason to take a test during the spring of junior year. There are also things that are impossible to control for that will ultimately lead a student to usually get a higher score when they test in the fall of senior year. The big things being that just in terms of that student's development, they will be older and wiser. They will have read more things and taken more math tests by the time they're in the fall of their junior year. So that's going to naturally help them grow. The other piece is that student investment. In the spring of junior year, college still feels kind of far off. Oftentimes by the fall of senior year or the summer leading up to senior year, students have started to fall for a particular school. There's a place that they can really envision themselves, and that lights a fire under them that may lead them to approach the testing process with more commitment, more focus than they were prepared to put into it in spring of junior year. And if that's the case, I don't think it's worth trying to fight uphill, but instead saying you should commit to this test when you're prepared to commit to this test as opposed to trying to force it. So that's where I see testing during the spring of junior year and fall of senior year are oftentimes the best times to do it. And leading up to that test, a student who's working with a tutor is probably starting maybe about 2 months before the test. It's typical for students to meet with a tutor somewhere between 8 and 12 times. That totally varies according to who the student is and what they need in order to be ready for the test. But if a student's starting getting ready for the test about 2 months in advance, that puts them on a pretty good timeline to ensure they're ready for test day.
Good, good. So I like what you talk about in terms of maturity and motivation, junior year versus senior year. I've seen that happen with students. And just to clarify too, because we talked about, initially middle school students and history exams and math and SATs, but I just want to make clear that you offer tutoring in a wide range of subjects and to any age student as well, correct?
Sure.
Yes.
Yes, we primarily work providing academic support for students from 6th grade through 12th grade, so middle school and high school. And then we help students with admissions tests, especially the SAT and ACT, but also some students who are testing into independent schools and need to take the SSAT or ISEE. And the wonderful thing that started to happen is some of the students that we saw 4 or 5 years ago for the SAT or ACT are now back to take the GRE or the LSAT, and that's something we can help with as well. And it's always nice to see them coming back as they get ready for that next stage of their life.
That's great. So what, if there's any one lesson or one message that you want to give to the audience so that maybe we go from this to a this on our grades? And not, again, to make everything grade conscious either, because it's really about learning to be a more effective learner, ultimately. You know, the grades are part of it, and I know how you feel about it. It's all about learning and being an effective, active learner in whatever you're doing, and that, you know, the grades will come too. So what message would you give to our audience about seeking out a tutor?
Sure. So I think the most important thing for both students and parents to be cognizant of is the fact that asking for help is a lifelong skill, and it is not an easy thing to do. It takes humility, it takes self-reflection, it takes character to say, this is hard and I think I need help. And I think for students to start to develop that skill early on, for parents and teachers to encourage them to ask questions about, how did I get this grade, or what would I need to have done differently in order to have ended up in a different place? I think knowing that asking for help is a lifelong skill, and it's one worth developing early, and that parents should do their best to be supportive of students as they develop that skill of asking for help. I really think that's the most important message for both students and parents to take away. And in many cases, a tutor can provide that help by helping the student to be reflective, helping the student to develop the skills that they need, so that ultimately that student can again be an independent learner.
Great. Travis, thank you so much for shedding light on this important topic on improving our learning skills that'll take us anywhere we want to go in life, right? So thanks for being our guest. I really appreciate your time, and thank you, audience, as well, for listening in. And if you have further questions, don't hesitate to write us on the station. Thanks again. Take care. Bye.